Hello, everyone who's out there. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Today, I'm joined by our CEO, Andrew Tong. Really, the intention of today's webinar is to provide detail on this week's announcement on the consortium with Glomar Minerals. We're also going to take the opportunity to give a market update and some updates around other parts of the business.
So with that, I'll just hand it over to you, Andrew, to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Joel, and it's great to be back doing a webinar. For those who've been listening for a while, you'd realize that it's nearly coming up to a year since I've been in this role as CEO, so it's great to be here today talking about the whole business. Obviously, Nodules and our consortium with Glomar is one part of it, but we've got some other things going on as well with our refinery, our Broken Hill Cobalt project and Halls Creek. But we're going to kick off today talking about our agreement with Glomar and try to explain a little bit about what our goals are here and why this is a great opportunity for our company. In terms of what we've just announced, we announced on Monday morning a consortium agreement with Glomar Minerals. They're a US-based company. They have access to polymetallic nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and there's a map there on the slide. It's largely the area between Hawaii and Mexico. So this is a well-known zone for polymetallic nodules. You may be familiar with a company called the Metals Company out of US, Canada. They're sort of the market leader in this segment. They've been developing a project out of there for a few years. Glomar Minerals has picked up tenement or licenses that go back to the Lockheed Martin activities from the 1980s. So for the last 40 years or so, there's been a lot of exploration development, a lot of ecological studies around these nodules at the bottom of the ocean. And Glomar now hold these licenses, and they've selected us to be their processing partner, their technology partner, to go and build a processing plant in the US. That's our goal and plan as a consortium. So it's great today to unpack some of that and explain that to our listeners. In terms of the agreement, what we've announced essentially is a consortium agreement. So there's still a long way to go to finalize contracts beneath that consortium agreement, to finalize how the two parties are going to work together. But essentially, we're going to partner around a processing plant. They'll do all of the work in terms of harvesting and permitting and logistics of the nodules from the ocean to the US, and we're going to partner on building this plant together. There's some obvious questions that come out of that. Why us? And I'll address that in a moment. But essentially, they've picked us because of our technology. The great work that we've done for our Kwinana Cobalt refinery is being taken over and modified for processing these materials. Why are we basing it in the US? Because that's really a domestic US processing capability, which they don't have much of at the moment. They don't have a lot of that midstream refining to produce the manganese and cobalt that they need for their domestic uses. And we'll touch on that in a moment. So first of all, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what are polymetallic nodules. And we've just got a slide here showing all of the metals that we're going to be getting out of this. Principally, it's a manganese story. These contain a little bit under 20% manganese. There's about 1% copper, 1% cobalt, 1% nickel. There's quite a lot of iron in there that if we can convert into a hematite becomes a nice quality iron product. There's some titanium and there's rare earths as well. But from a volume basis, it's really a manganese and cobalt story. And already, hopefully you can see the links to our cobalt business because we're one of the leaders in cobalt processing technology. That's one of our core advantages to now modify that process and start to incorporate the production of manganese sulfate. These two commodities, cobalt and manganese, tie together very strongly as we think about the next decade of battery innovation and development. And manganese batteries is really where the US market is starting to head. They're starting to head towards manganese-rich batteries, and some of you may have seen that in analyst reports. But these manganese-rich batteries are 60% manganese with a few percent cobalt and lithium. They're effectively swapping high nickel for high manganese batteries. And that's a very much US-centric story around battery chemistries. And I'll leave it to you rather than name drop the various companies involved in that R&D. So we're trying to integrate into that supply chain, and our cobalt business gives us that starting point at that foundation with those offtake discussions that we're having in Korea and Japan, then to step off the cobalt and start talking about manganese and cobalt as well in the US. There's a lot of tie-ups and links to our existing business. And for us, this opportunity on nodules is definitely complementary. It's not a pivot. It's not a change in strategy. It's a complementary addition to our core business of providing cobalt from Australia out to those end markets. So that's a little bit about what these nodules are and how much they contain for these metals. I think the most important point is that there's roughly 30 to 40% of a nodule is metallic that can be recovered into products. It's very, very high grade material. So let's just talk about what we're actually planning to do. What is this work program that's proposed? So in that announcement around the consortium, we've laid out that we want to ultimately go build a 200,000 ton nodule processing plant in the US. So 200,000 tons of nodules is going to generate approximately 40,000 ton of manganese, which we want to convert into manganese sulfate for sale to the US battery market. There'll be about 1,000 to 2,000 ton of cobalt, 1,000 ton of nickel, 1,000 ton of copper, and then some titanium and rare earths as well. In terms of our work program, the key part for Cobalt Blue shareholders is that over the next 18 months or so, we'll be completing a feasibility study for this project. And the anticipation is that we're going to enter into contractual arrangements with Glomar to pay for that feasibility study. So we'll be a provider of the engineering and the test work services into this consortium agreement. Once we complete that study, and assuming that it's successful, then we'll enter into negotiations around how to facilitate construction of the plant. Why is this a good opportunity for Cobalt Blue? Well, as on this slide, we have the Broken Hill Technology Centre. That's already set up to do the piloting work for this project for Glomar. We've previously already tested nodules and shown that we can get over 90% manganese, cobalt, nickel, and copper into solution. And so we need to now pilot that flow sheet. So we've got a pilot plant ready to go. We've got our patented refinery flow sheet from Kwinana ready to now deploy at other projects in addition to Kwinana. And we have the ability to run at this really quickly and deliver to the timeframes that Glomar Minerals are seeking. They're aiming to have their plant built and up and running before the end of the decade, ideally around the end of 2028, start of 2029. So in a very fast timeline, if Glomar are able to secure the funding for this project, then we'll be providing these services into this project on a very quick timeline. And they need to have companies like us ready to go with technology and facilities ready to do the piloting. We think that there's immense support for this emerging sector coming out of the US. And you would have seen in our announcement references to some of the presidential executive orders around unleashing the America's potential in this space. There's enormous support to see a nodules processing plant up and running in the US. We think this is a great opportunity for Cobalt Blue with its other projects to really step out onto the world stage beyond Australia and be delivering in another country, being the US market, which is significantly larger and in one sense, more resourced to be able to provide support to these sorts of projects. In terms of some of the benefits to Cobalt Blue that are going to flow out of it, I've already covered that we're aiming to have some paid services in this early feasibility study stage of the project, but we really need to conclude some of our negotiations around that before we're able to provide further updates to the market. But we think this, as a team, we think this is a really exciting project to get started on, but I just really wanted to reiterate that this is complementary to our existing cobalt business. Joel, with that, I'll pass back to you. That's a bit of an introduction to this consortium with Glomar. Joel, you're just on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll go back to that a bit more detail in the Q&A section on Glomar. But I thought I'd take the opportunity to give a market update, particularly given since we last provided a webinar. Prices, as you can see by the cobalt chart, have been very exciting. Really, since about this time last year, when we got the announcement of the export ban, the temporary export ban from the DRC, is when the price started to move, and it's just continually gone up throughout this period. Will the price be sustained? We certainly think so, because what the DRC has done is put export rations or quotas of what is going to be able to leave the country. And that level at this point is far below global demand for cobalt. So that's why the price has risen to this point. That's why it'll continue to stay high. Another very interesting market that we don't usually spend a lot of time talking about, but for relatively obvious reasons, the geopolitical turmoil at the moment in the Middle East, you've got a pretty high sulfur price. That's important to our Broken Hill Cobalt project because, of course, one of the major byproducts of the cobalt is sulfur. So when you put these two things together and rerun the economics, there's obviously many ways to do that, but you run spot prices through the economics of that project, and it's again very compelling, as it was a few years ago before the market downturn in both cobalt and sulfur pricing. So that has actually ignited a bit of activity for us at the Broken Hill Cobalt project. I'll throw it back to you, Andrew. Can you give us a little detail on what we're up to this year?
Sure, thanks, Joel. Yes, for our Broken Hill Cobalt project, we've got two main goals that we're progressing this year. One is to get all of our environmental permit studies completed and then submitted into the government. So long-term listeners will realize that we've done a lot of development work for the Broken Hill Cobalt project. Where that's up to at the moment is that we can't really advance until all of the permitting studies are done and the permits are approved for that project. And at that point, then we can really consider moving ahead to the FID stage and moving ahead with that project. So this year, it's all about the permits, getting all of the studies completed and then submitted into New South Wales government around that. And at the same time, we're working on an updated feasibility study to incorporate all of the recent commodity movements, but also thinking a bit about where the whole cobalt market has moved over the last couple of years. I think importantly for shareholders around the Broken Hill Cobalt project is that we're seeing over the next 3 to 5 year period, really strong demand for cobalt, but we need to overlay that demand for cobalt with the need for refined cobalt. And so I just really wanted to reiterate our strategy, which is before we start the Broken Hill Cobalt mine into production, we need to build our refinery in Kwinana first. That really is where the gap in the global market is, which is refined cobalt. So when Joel and I have just been to Japan and Korea talking with all of the battery manufacturers over there, the key thing that we're hearing for cobalt is that the non-China supply chain options for cobalt are very limited, while the demand for non-China cobalt is increasing. And so they really are asking us to get the Kwinana refinery online as quick as possible. And just wanted to share this in terms of our overall capital demands and financial risk. The refinery is going to be approximately 60 to 80 million Aussie dollars to build versus a mine of something like 600 to 800 million dollars to build. So it's about 1/10 the financial outlay, which means that as we then bring that project online, the critical juncture for critical minerals is the first 1 to 2 years of operation. And by building our refinery first, we can run that for 1 to 2 years and qualify the product into the downstream market, which is the hardest part of all these critical minerals projects, is getting product qualified to then have stable returns to pay back the financing. And so the juncture that we're at with the Kwinana refinery is pulling together on one hand the financing interest, which is there, but needing offtake agreements, and the offtake parties that want to see the plant built, but are uncertain how to enter into agreements until the plant is built and your product's qualified. So we're negotiating around that middle area to bring both sides of the story together, the financing interest and the offtake interest, with the appropriate conditions precedent that everybody is happy to sign off on. So that's the negotiating hurdle that we're working through at the moment. But in terms of the market demand, they would love to see Kwinana get up. They would love to see cobalt sulfate being sold out of there. Once that happens, it significantly de-risks Broken Hill Cobalt project. And so that's sort of the timing and the layering of our projects that we're talking to the market. But over the longer term, Broken Hill Cobalt project is really essential to vertically integrate and feed that cobalt into our refinery and then back out to the market. Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, just to reiterate again, we've been working very hard and diligently on trying to get to FID. And it really is, as Andrew detailed, and you can see there on the slide, all the ticks of things that have been done over the past year to get to that point. And really the final remaining hurdle is that financing package, which is a bit of chicken and egg versus the funders versus the off-takers. But I just don't know how to say it any stronger that we are working on this every day. We speak to people every day, just trying to get across that very important juncture.
I think,
So,
Joel, one of
go ahead.
the interesting things in the cobalt market, and some listeners that may be aware that in terms of the Glencore assets out of the DRC, it's public information, but Orion out of the US are looking to buy 40% of those assets. And that was announced publicly in January, February this year. And I think that just goes to demonstrate that the US financing community are really keen to be engaged in the cobalt market, and they're going upstream to enter into the cobalt mine supply. And there really is this gap of the refining capacity, and we're getting a lot of encouraging conversations around how Kwinana can really start to be part of that fully integrated supply chain from some of those mines outside of Australia, but Kwinana or Australia playing a key role in the midstream. And that's a story that often gets overlooked, I think, within our Australia lens, is what role can we play as a midstream refinery in these commodities, as opposed to just looking at our own mine supply. And that midstream capability is where Cobalt Blue really shines, or has this opportunity through our technology to really step into that gap and deliver that capability, A, for these supply chains, but B, for Australia.
And it's just actually a quite fantastic added bonus that we're now putting together this consortium with the US company who's asking us to be their midstream provider. So now this separate proposal is sitting on desks across the US government, DOE, DOW, all of those key agencies that are helping to fund this new and emerging non-China critical mineral supply chain. So that's sort of an indirect route of another benefit of the Glomar consortium. I'm going to stop sharing the slides there, Andrew, and answer some of these questions that have come in. This is one from one of our most important and long-term holders. You've talked about it already, but let's just make this very clear. Is the Glomar Minerals Consortium a pivot away from our core assets and strategy?
No, not at all. I don't see this as a pivot. It's a complementary opportunity. I think there's a few comments that should be put on the table. Number one is Cobalt Blue isn't a single asset company. We have a number of assets, and I think that's great exposure across both commodities like cobalt, copper, silver up at Horse Creek, and now with nodules also teasing into the manganese market. So it's great for us to be multi-commodity and multi-asset company. As we all know, being a single asset company is great when things are good, but when things are down, it's problematic. So having that optionality and that exposure is really important to me as a CEO, is to have that that diversity of assets. That puts us in a different sort of basket. We're not your typical junior mining company on the ASX. Realistically, we're a minerals processing midstream company with mining assets. And that's a bit of a nuance, but it's because we're so strong on our process engineering and technology that we can partner with Glomar for their resource and their mining asset. We can provide that midstream refining capability. We hold Broken Hill, and that's really important to us for vertical integration. But really, we can only unlock Broken Hill if we get our refinery up and going. And as long-term listeners would realize, even Broken Hill itself, moving into cobalt pyrite, needs technology to unlock that resource. And I think this is sometimes a point lost, is that there's a lot of great in-ground resources, but if you don't have the processing technology or smarts to unlock it, then those resources get stranded sometimes. And Cobalt Blue is providing that optionality through our technology to unlock things like Broken Hill, and now in our consortium with Glomar to unlock the value of metals in nodules. So no, it's not a pivot. It's not either or. It's a everything strategy, and they're complementary.
So again, just for full clarification and everyone's understood, does this impact the timing of our Kwinana Cobalt Refinery developments or any of the other Cobalt Blue projects?
It doesn't affect our Kwinana refinery. As I tried to explain a little bit before, we're doing work at Broken Hill, but realistically, Broken Hill will only come online if the refinery is already up and going. So we need to build our refinery first, and our refinery, as I explained before, is at the moment negotiating through those agreements. If we are able to successfully negotiate those, then that project is full steam ahead, moving towards FID and all those other things. We'll roll that project out. This agreement with Glomar doesn't detract from that timeline. That timeline is still valid and in place. Really, Joel, the answer is our team will continue to grow to manage all these things simultaneously.
Yeah, in fact, I'd argue that this tie-up with Glomar is actually an enhancement to the strategy around Kwinana, because what it does is it validates our technology, that people, other groups are coming to us because they want a similar refinery that Kwinana will eventually be. And then it also just validates our credit around the world, not only in Australia, but around the world, that we are a company that can deliver this. We're essentially we can be a services company that can deliver this. Let's just move quickly on, just so to continue the clarification and full understanding. Let's talk about the funding. Where will the funding for this U.S. refinery come from, and who's funding the feasibility studies and the piloting program?
So in the shorter term, Glomar are raising funds to move ahead with the feasibility study. And then in the longer term, the two parties are looking at further funding for the project. As you can imagine, the first part is really getting sufficient capital to be able to do the study work, and Glomar are running with that. Now that they have us as their partner, they're able to better execute their funding plan around raising their capital and then moving ahead with that. But collectively, and I say that in the context of a consortium, we're working together on some funding options for the plant, but obviously that'll be contingent on milestones and all those sorts of things. So that's all commercial in confidence at the moment while we talk to parties around that. But essentially for Cobalt Blue shareholders, in the short term, this is really a services style contract with Glomar for the feasibility study work. And we're going to be negotiating how the longer term picture looks like in the future.
Yep. So just to be clear, as I keep saying, there is no capital up front that Cobalt Blue needs to contribute.
No, not in the short term.
That's right. So basically it's a contract that they're providing, or we're providing services to them in terms of the feasibility program. Great. Well, let's move on. Maybe a little more detail on the U.S. refinery itself. Where are we thinking about building it?
So we've already been talking to a number of state economic development committees around where that plant should be based in the US. The obvious location is somewhere along their coastline, so we're really considering along the Gulf coastline. But yeah, I can't really provide too many details today on that. A lot of those are confidential discussions, but certainly shareholders should be looking out for announcements around that over the coming months.
Yeah, that region, sort of the Gulf Coast area and Atlantic coast, has become quite a battery hub. There's a number of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese battery companies that have set up there. It just makes sense given the size of the U.S. market, and particularly as it continues to grow for both electric vehicles and other battery uses. And of course, being and having that major port infrastructure along there just makes it attractive and relatively low cost just to move things around on the sea. So it really makes sense to build stuff there. Why aren't we building this particular plant in Kwinana? That's another question. I think we just sort of answered that. Kwinana is an attractive market, particularly if we're importing material from Africa and then over to Asia. So that makes sense. But again, this is all about addressing the US market.
Anything to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the end markets for the products. So Kwinana for us is the right location within Australia for a cobalt refinery because Australia has no cobalt refining capability. So to put a plant there makes sense when we think about the combination of, as you said, Joel, importing cobalt from the largest cobalt mining country in the world, DRC. So Kwinana, WA is the best jurisdiction to be able to bring that across. And it also is really, really well connected to Broken Hill because of the train line. So that's a really easy transport route for our activity in Broken Hill to make a cobalt hydroxide in Broken Hill and send it from Broken Hill to Kwinana for refining. Refineries really need to be based at port locations to then sell the products out to market. And again, just coming graphically to the supply chain, it's going to go from Africa to WA or Broken Hill to WA, or from the WA nickel industry, the cobalt byproducts from the WA nickel industry to Perth, Kwinana area. So those three lines all intersect. And then from there up into Asia is a very, very simple supply chain route. But the quantity of cobalt is a bit limited. There's no point building a huge cobalt refinery there because the use of that cobalt is up in those Asian countries. So there's a size limit to the sort of project that you'd want to build there. And the quantities that we've been talking about for Kwinana, between 3,000 to 6,000 tonne of cobalt, is roughly equivalent to 10 times that in nickel. So 60 to 100,000 tonne nickel facility, the cobalt is kind of the equivalence in terms of importance for the battery market. When we go to nodules, the key commodity is the manganese. And so to produce that much manganese sulfate, you want to be close to the manganese sulfate users. And as I said before, that's the emerging manganese market within the US is for the battery market. So when we think about midstream refineries, you want to put them closer to your markets than necessarily the feed.
Yeah, let's just maybe riff on the manganese a little bit because there are a couple questions. And you and I we attended one of the world's largest battery conferences in Seoul a couple weeks ago. And so the usual, or you can imagine that the cohort was there, LG, Samsung, SDI, and plus all the major battery raw material makers and PCAM makers. And they all had these huge, very fancy disco light booths that they were attracting people to. But I think you and I were both struck that every single one of these large booths had a section talking about the growth and development of manganese-rich batteries. You want to share some of your thoughts around that?
Sure. I think that within the battery market, there is definitely segmentation going on around who's going to make what sort of batteries and what end customer companies are going to use which sort of batteries. And so what the reflections that Joel and I saw over there was, for example, in storage batteries, so for your house or something, it's not just your lithium phosphate batteries. There's a lot of nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries now being developed for that, because people are after energy density and they want smaller batteries in their homes and quicker discharge. And so there really is no one battery for one market, or one use. It's lots of different types of batteries, but each of the companies are playing differently in that space. For these manganese-rich batteries, it's, as I come back to already, it's being driven a lot by the US automakers wanting to go long on manganese-rich batteries and substitute the manganese for the nickel. And obviously there's a price consideration in that. But the cobalt is there, and some people will recall me speaking at other events where cobalt is so important in the batteries for fire and for safety control. And so, yeah, cobalt's in those sorts of batteries, in those manganese-rich batteries. But all of those battery makers are wanting to make all the types of batteries, and so they're playing across all the chemistries, but the final users are also buying all the chemistries for their markets.
Yeah, I was really struck. I had sort of resigned to the fact that energy storage systems, stationary batteries, were 100% LFP, the cheapest yet heaviest and largest sort of chemistry out there. But some of the big Korean battery makers were telling us that they've got a huge book of these more compact energy storage systems for garages and whatnot that are manganese/nickel/cobalt chemistries. So that was quite surprising. And the other surprising of increased segment demand is robotics, not just humanoid robotics, which there were several just sort of marching around the conference floor, all being run by nickel cobalt batteries, but also for manufacturing robotics, like basically automated peopleless forklifts and other type of warehouse machinery that's being driven by batteries. And so that was a huge part of the conference, this type of industrial use. So it's and of course with all the defense demand rising and drones and that sort of thing, this segment of demand, which used to be a quite small proportion of overall cobalt and nickel and manganese demand, is rising very, very quickly and commanding a much larger share beyond just EV. So it's a more diversified story than when this company began, which is quite exciting, and that's why manganese really fits into our commodity profile.
Joel, do you remember those UPS batteries for data centers? They were everywhere at the conference as well. So those rack style servers, but racks of just batteries for UPS backup for the data centers. They were all manganese rich batteries.
Yeah, it was eye-opening. Okay, well, enough on our conference tales. There are a number of questions, a little bit more detail on Glomar itself, and C nodules. Andrew, would you mind sort of giving a summary of history of this company and their history with C nodules themselves?
Sure. So Glomar Minerals itself is recently formed as incorporated as a company. However, the key people behind it have been involved in nodules for a very long time. The principal there, the CEO, Chris Williams, was previously running the Lockheed Martin exploration program for deep sea nodules. And as I said in my intro comments, Lockheed Martin first acquired exploration licenses back in the 1980s for these nodules. And then through the course of time, they've changed hands and so on. but effectively all of that know-how and knowledge is now sitting within Glomar Minerals. Previously, groups like Hatch, engineering firm Hatch, and others have done a lot of work on processing of the nodules. So there is a lot of historical information around that. And I think where we come into this, importantly, we're not at the very, very beginning. There's a number of decades of work on this, but what we are able to do is leverage in and take all of that information on the processing side and modify that into our particular flow sheet. But in terms of Glomar Minerals, yes, they've got a long history on the nodules. They're heavily involved in things like the International Seabed Authority around the licensing and permitting. I think importantly, they hold exploration licenses, and there will no doubt be questions around how does this move ahead. At this point in time, they're all exploration licenses. There's the International Seabed Authority, which is a UN associated body. They're working through the regulatory program to ultimately be able to move from exploration to mining leases. That program is going to take a number of years, but as resource people, we can appreciate that on an exploration lease, you're able to withdraw a certain amount each year from an EL before it becomes an ML. And so all of the work that we're talking about is going to come from those exploration leases while we're doing those permitting studies with the International Seabed Authority.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to reiterate, is that this is not they are not a new company. And of course, that's part of the reason they were attracted to us. But like you said, decades of work behind this company and the people, collectively decades of experience. So it's certainly not a new company or a new venture for them. They've been involved in this sector for many, many years. And in fact, that's what attracted them to us. Obviously because of our experience, the fact that we have the Broken Hill Technology Center literally ready to go. As soon as they send over product, we can start testing it and working through the pilot and pre-feasibility studies. And that's a pretty unique venture, the fact that we have that operating. So when we first started discussing with them, they knew we had the ability to build a refinery because they were looking at the Kwinana cobalt refinery reports and studies. But once it was very clear to them that we have an actual operating plant that we can utilize right now, that was very attractive, because there really isn't any other plant like that anywhere else in the world. Right. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. I've got a question that's completely different than anything else we've touched on. With silver prices rising, and noting that Halls Creek has a pretty significant silver resource, has that changed our outlook on that project? Can you answer that for us, Andrew?
Yeah, so for Halls Creek project, copper, silver, zinc project up in the northern section of Western Australia. At the moment, we're retrieving our samples from up there, some old drill core, and we're planning to commence a test work program to see if we can recover the silver in addition to the copper and zinc. We're hoping to complete that work and then obviously publish those results. If we're able to recover even half of that silver or more, it significantly changes the economic outlook for that project. Just to reiterate, that project is looking at a heap leach project for the first half, about 5 or 6 years of an open cut heap leach project, and then potentially going underground for the second 5 years of the project for a copper and zinc concentrates. But at this stage, we're focused on the open cut heap leach operation, and we're now looking to see if we can recover some of the silver in there, and that will be tied up in an updated market release when that work's completed later this year.
Thank you. I might just use the last couple minutes just to wrap things up. I think just the most important thing I'd like investors and visitors to take away from this announcement that we made on Monday about the consortium is that there are no near-term funding requirements. This is a project that's starting with some piloting and a pre-feasibility study that Glomar is funding, and Cobalt Blue is not up for that. So I just want to make that very clear. Any last words from you, Andrew?
I just want to thank everyone for listening in today. And if you have further questions, please email them through to Joel or myself, and happy to have a follow-up conversation.
Yes, thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you very much to our shareholders, longstanding and new. Very much appreciated. It's a pretty wild ride out there, but we're all hanging on, and we're obviously all hoping that things get better towards as the year progresses. So again, we'll wrap this up here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew.